In this video, we'll talk about the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act was the first federal law to enact a wide variety of regulatory activities. It shows the federal government's shift from what is called a distributive policy of government to a regulatory policy at the end of the turn of the 20th century. The older distributive model of government invested money and resources to encourage the growth of key industries, like the railroad. The thought being that through this growth, the nation would benefit in the long run. While not everyone would or could travel on train across the country, those that did would help to expand the boundaries of America and its economy. Instead of investing money to grow key industries, in regulatory policy, the government puts more resources towards the oversight and regulation of the nation's businesses. This model works to ensure that more people can benefit from these businesses. Along these lines, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 created a role for the federal government in the regulation of product purity, product production and distribution, and the advertising of food, beverages, and medicine. Although ultimately recommended by President Theodore Roosevelt and passed by both the Senate and the House by a wide margin, the development of the Pure Food and Drug Act was not a smooth process. Passing this act in Congress was only possible after decades of pressure from the popular media, scientific studies, and changes from within the food and drug industries themselves. As more and more people left small towns and the countryside for city living, they gave up the ability to produce their own foods and goods, or to purchase these goods locally in nearby shops. Instead, many city dwellers relied upon mail-order goods or shopped in busy markets whose shelves were lined with pre-prepared products from large food and drug manufacturers. While advertising was often a top priority for these new companies, quality was not always. To encourage customers to purchase their goods, manufacturers in the late 20th century would advertise their products using many of the methods and images we have discussed earlier in this workshop. The goal was to build a sense of trust by showing images and using descriptions that reminded potential buyers of familiar people and scenes from the country, or those that appealed to the excitement of the city or technological advances. As advertising styles developed, changes were also occurring in popular magazines and in scientific circles. In an effort to inform readers, newspapers and magazines such as Ladies' Home Journal and Collier's published articles about the troubling sanitary and safety practices of food and drug manufacturers. Wholesome images and claims were not always to be trusted. For example, the newspaper Appeal to Reason published early sections of Upton Sinclair's famous book, The Jungle. This showcased horrific conditions workers faced in Chicago's meatpacking district. Likewise, the Ladies' Home Journal asked its readers to start a letter-writing campaign to demand the President and Congress take a more active role in the oversight of the U.S. food and drug manufacturing. Scientific studies also contributed to the growing pressure to reform. Beginning in the 1880s, the newly formed U.S. Bureau of Chemistry, headed by Dr. Harvey Wiley, focused its efforts on analyzing the contents of various canned foods and drugs. His research uncovered findings such as charcoal containing ground pepper, cottonseed oil and lard, and cans of potted turkey that were found to have no turkey. Eventually, the Bureau of Chemistry transitioned from simply reporting these undesirable added ingredients to researching the negative health effects of these additives. Research began to look both at the tested food, beverages, and drugs, and also at the health of those who consumed them. In 1902, under Dr. Wiley's leadership, the Bureau of Chemistry's food laboratory began to study the impact of food preservatives on human nutrition, and in 1903, the drug laboratory began similar analysis of proprietary medications and drugs shipped by mail. Due to increased pressure from consumers and science, the manufacturing industries began to plan for change. Some proposed their own regulatory rules and supervisory teams instead of oversight from the federal government. Many in patent medicine industry pleaded to voluntarily reduce the amount of alcohol in their products and end false advertising. Some members of the manufacturing industry, however, welcomed federal oversight, as this would make interstate sales much easier to fulfill. During the late 20th century, many states had enacted separate and often conflicting manufacturing guidelines and regulations due to the lack of federal oversight. Products made in one state could not always be sold in another. Federal rules that would govern the production of food and drugs would do away with this patchwork method and ultimately might enable wider distribution. By 1906, the federal government decided to act. Convinced by the public, by science, and by the manufacturing industry itself, President Theodore Roosevelt recommended in December 1905 that Congress pass legislation ensuring the purity of food, beverages, and drugs. The Senate passed the bill first on February 21st, 1906, by a vote of 63-4. And in June of that year, the House passed a similar bill by a vote of 241-17. A compromise bill between both levels of Congress was produced in 6 days, and on June 30th, 1906, the President signed the act. The Pure Food and Drug Act would go into effect on January 1st, 1907.